Hi, guys. We thought we'd read you a book for the Japanese unit so that you guys can get a better understanding of what's going on. So, we're going to read the book called Shipwreck by Rhonda Bloomberg. My name in Japan, it looks like this and written. It also means road, simple, and masculine. You could also look online and see what yours is, but that's what my name is, and I thought we'd just get started. Shipwrecked. Head of the family at age 9. When his father died in 1836, Manjiro had to support his mother, three younger sisters, and one younger brother, and an invalid older brother who was too weak to work. Manjiro's family lived in poverty, as did their neighbors. Their squalid shacks were huddled together, a village in the province of Tosa. The men were fishermen, a vocation that had to be handed down father to son. Manjiro's father had been a fisherman, therefore, Manjiro would be a fisherman. Sons were forbidden to find any other field of employment. That had been the law of the land for hundreds of years. Day after day, Manjiro set out to sea with boatloads of men. His job consisted of unhooking fish and emptying nets. Because he was a child, he had no chance to cast a catch. The men paid for him by giving him fish to take home. They were very poor and could not afford to be more generous. After 5 years of this child labor, Manjiro was unable to advance past the position of being a mere helper. And so he sought work at Usa, another coastal village 90 miles away. A fisherman called Denzo questioned him, and after learning about Manjiro's family's sad plight, Denzo welcomed him aboard a small fishing boat that he had borrowed from a friend. The crew consisted of Denzo, his two brothers, Gomen and Jasuke, his friend, Teroman, and Manjiro. The group located the boat with rice, firewood, and drinking water, prepared to spend up to 3 days at sea. On the morning of January 5th, 1841, they rowed 30 miles out and cast all the nets they had. But there wasn't a fish to be caught. At night, they anchored near shore and slept fitfully until sunrise. The next day at sea proved equally disappointing, even when they tried their luck with rods and straw ropes strung with hooks. Again, they lay at anchor for the night. The third day, they ran into a school of mackerel. They were gleefully casting and filling their nets when the sky turned black. Before they could get ready to head in, walls of waves banged against their boat with such force that the oars and the rudder were washed away. Then a ferocious wind attacked. It broke their masts and ripped their sail. The terrified crew expected to be dumped into the ocean. It was a miracle that the boat didn't capsize. Instead, it went on a wild ride, steered by wind and waves. When night fell, sleet and freezing cold added to the group's agony. Their drenched clothes were frozen stiff. Icicles hung from their sleeves, sashes and hair. Fortunately, the icicles, composed of fresh water, proved to be lifesavers. They sucked them, for the supply of drinking water had gone overboard. Sleet, scrapped from the boat, also satisfied their thirst, and cold, raw chunks of the mackerel they had caught halted their hunger. Day after day they clung to the sides of the boat, riding the swells of the sea, terrified, trembling from winter's cold, waiting for death to end their misery. At the mercy of water and wind, they helplessly rode the waves, not knowing when or where their lives would end. The storm lasted 1 week without let-up. On the 8th day, the ocean became calm, yet the disabled boat was carried forward by a strong underwater current. The fishermen felt as though they had fallen off the edge of the earth, for they could see nothing but sky and sea. At noon, Denzo said he spotted an island floating on the horizon. Since the others didn't see it, they suspected that suffering had caused Denzo to hallucinate. But soon, land loomed ahead for everyone. They had sighted the island of Teroshima, located more than 300 miles from Japan. Using pieces of boards as oars, they rowed with all their might until the boat was about half a mile from shore. The island's steep cliffs looked forbidding. Rocks and reefs just above the water's surface kept them from lowering closer. They were all paralyzed with fear. How could they land without crashing their craft? Rather than risk immediate action, they delayed decision by spending the night on board their battered boat. At daylight, they rowed around the island, looking in vain for a safe place to land. Because the shallow waters were spiked with rocks, they could not row to shore. Therefore, they decided to swim. They jumped into the sea just minutes before the boat crashed against sharp rocks and was smashed to bits. All swam for their lives. Fright and the fight for survival supplied their bodies with unusual energy. Exhausted and freezing from cold, they helped one another climb ashore. Jasuke, with its dreadful shape, his leg had been badly hurt by the boat's floating debris, but despite severe pain, he joined the others, climbing a cliff to level land. Then all of them collapsed, glad to be on solid ground. The deserted island of Tirashima, where Manjuro was shipwrecked, the sketches designed by John Mung, the name Americans gave Manjuro. Manjuro and Denzo were first on their feet. They told the others that they would explore the land and return with a report. Their findings were disheartening. The island was no more than 2 miles around, with steep slopes rising everywhere directly from the sea. It was just a jumble of rocks and volcanic ash, with a few scrubby, inedible plants and swarms of large white birds waddling about, clattering, whistling, and croaking. The island of Tirashima is the only breeding ground for colonies of short-tailed albatross. Thousands of these large, beautiful, snow-white creatures nest on the island's cliffs, safe because there are no predators. The birds obtain all their food by flying and fishing in the ocean. Albatross don't need fresh water because their bodies filter salt water into a nourishing liquid. There were caves in this bird city. The largest they could find was just about big enough to shelter the group. The castaways made it their headquarters. The entrance was so small they had to crouch to enter it. At home, all were accustomed to sleeping on the ground in their huts, where mats covered the dirt floors. Instead of mats, boards that had drifted ashore from the bashed boat were slid inside and laid on top of the ground. The wood had no use as fuel because their flint for making fire had gone overboard. Living conditions were miserable. Their shelter was cramped, dank, and dark, but it was better than being exposed to bad weather and living among noisy, beak-clicking birds. The injured Jasuke wasn't able to fend for himself. His brother Denzo took care of him. As a result, the task of finding food belonged to the others. These exiled islanders survived by eating seaweed and a sparse supply of shellfish found clinging to rocks. They also gulped down the raw flesh of an albatross. To vary their menu, Manjuro sometimes skinned albatross, then dried their meat in the sun. The birds had never encountered humans or any other predators, and therefore were so tame and unafraid that they did not waddle away when anyone approached to grab them. They could fly only if they took off with a running start from a high cliff. Fresh water trapped in the crevices of hollow rocks provided drinking water, but the supply was so limited that the unfortunate 5 agreed upon this rule. 1 oyster shell filled with water was allowed with each albatross eaten. They stored water in a pail that had been washed ashore from their wrecked boat. After several weeks, Toramon and Gomen became feverishly ill. Manjuro, the youngest and brightest of the group, was the only one able to leave the cave and bring back provisions. In April, the group survived an earthquake that nearly entombed them. The castaways had been resting inside the cave when they were jolted by tremors that made them quake in terror. They heard horrendous noises as rocks fell and showers of stones blocked the entrance to their cave. Fearing the cave could be their death trap, the castaways worked frantically, panting, straining, dripping with sweat, until they cleared the entrance and saw daylight. In May, the albatross migrated. The group nearly starved. The fishermen had been prisoners on the island for 5 months. During that time, the castaways endured bone-chilling cold, hunger, loneliness, and worst of all, the outlook of hopelessness. They had no idea where on earth they were, but they did know they were far away from Japan, a country that had deliberately isolated itself from the rest of the world. The government of Japan enforced thousands of laws to isolate its people from the rest of the world. Foreigners were never allowed to land. Even books about foreigners were banned. In the 1830s, most Japanese people didn't know that the French Revolution, the American Revolution, and the Industrial Revolution had taken place. Anyone who left the land of the rising sun gave up his right to return home because he had been poisoned by outside influence and by forbidden information. Many Japanese people were led to believe that other nations were evil empires made up of monsters. They had been taught that men and women who lived in other parts of the world were treacherous. Words like barbarian, devil, and demon were used to describe anyone from overseas. Only a few scholars had access to maps, but these maps were often mythological, not geographical, with sketches of misshapen beasts and frightening friends who inhabited faraway lands. Japan was depicted as the heavily blessed center of the universe. Because people from other nations were looked upon as enemies, aliens for foreign ships were prohibited in Japanese ports. Their captains and crews risked prison or death if they did not heed the closed-door policy of isolationism. Dutchmen were the only foreign traders permitted in Japan at that time. These barbarians lived like prisoners, guarded by police, confined behind a high wall on the tiny island of Deshima in Nagasaki Harbor. They were there because of trade. They brought in firearms, fabrics, tobacco, and spectacles for the wealthy Japanese, and they took out copper, gold, and silks for the European market. The Dutch traders also offered a window to the outside world for a select number of high-level Japanese officials and scholars by bringing them books and maps. No more than 12 or 13 Dutchmen took turns living there. They were not allowed to leave their island prison more than once or twice a year. Then they needed special permission from police, who accompanied them, monitored their actions and speech, and made sure that they did not talk to anyone except designated officials who received very limited information about the world across the sea. Ships of other nations stayed away. It wasn't worth risking lives in order to visit or trade with a hostile country. Japan would succeed in maintaining peace for nearly 2.5 centuries, 1603 to 1855, a record never matched by any other nation. During this time, the nation prospered, flourishing in art and literature. However, in this era, known as the Great Peace, people's freedom was limited by the enforcement of rigid rules and ruthless punishments. Laws specified every phase of people's existence. Where they lived, people were not permitted to travel outside their home district unless they received permission from the police. The size, design, and structure of their homes. Wood huts and dirt or cobblestone floors were required for fishermen. Whatever they owned was determined. The kind of lanterns and types of toys were specified. How they behaved. The lower the bow, the more important the person being greeted. For nobility, one had to kowtow, get down on all fours, placing one's forehead on the ground. The design of their clothes was determined, from the emperor down to the lowest class citizen. Even the material, the color of the garment, and the size and number of stitches were designed by edicts to determine class. Disobedience brought harsh penalties. The standard fishermen were sure they were doomed to live out the rest of their lives on this bleak island. They dreamed of going home, but realized that even if by chance some ship would rescue them and take them back to Japan, they would be convicted by this law. Any person who leaves a country to go to another and later returns will be put to death. The reality of rescue was far-fetched. The following laws made sure that no Japanese ship would be able to sail as far as their boat had drifted. The sending of ships to any foreign country is forbidden. The construction of large ships, capable of sailing long distances, is prohibited. People were limited to small boats that could be used for fishing or transporting merchandise along Japan's coast and among its islands. Fishermen and cargo boatmen were given some leeway. They were allowed to be away for several days, but weeks and months? No excuse was acceptable, not even shipwreck. Anyone who disobeyed edicts that specified limit travel risked imprisonment or a death sentence. Here they were, far away from home, forsaken. They would have to spend the rest of their lives marooned on this miserable island.